The smell of diesel exhaust never fully left Elena Vasquez. Aviation fuel, hot engine oil, the copper bite of blood baking in desert heat. She had carried those smells across 2 continents and 3 classified theaters of operation. Every morning at 5:47 a.m., she carried them into the loading dock of Hargrove Memorial Hospital, where they were mercifully replaced by industrial bleach. She preferred the bleach. Elena was 41 years old, with a face sculpted by weather and a pair of dark brown eyes that moved in the slow, methodical sweep of someone who had learned that stillness was a liability. She wore her black hair in a ruthlessly practical braid, not for aesthetics, old habits. Her title was Emergency Medical Technician, Transport and Logistics. The nurses called her the Ambulance Girl. Dr. Franklin Marsh, Chief of Emergency Surgery, called her nothing at all. He looked through her the way a man looks through a window, acknowledging the glass existed only when it needed cleaning. She drove inter-facility transfers, ran supply carts on busy nights, existed, in the hierarchy of Hargrove Memorial, somewhere between the parking attendants and the food service staff. She had taken the job 14 months ago. The HR coordinator had been cheerful. Any prior medical experience we should know about? Elena had looked at the form. The box was small. There wasn't enough space. Some field experience, she had said, and signed her name. She did not mention that field experience meant 11 years as a Special Operations Combat Medic with 1st SVOD Delta, that her hands had been inside 11 human chest cavities before she turned 32, that her unit had called her Ghost Doc because she had a talent for appearing exactly where a dying man needed her to be. She took the ambulance keys and went to work, quiet, manageable, the kind of life the VA counselor had told her she needed, after the shoulder surgery, after the classified medical review board that had determined her operational career was concluded. She was fine with concluded. She had concluded things before. The morning that everything changed began like every other morning. Elena arrived at 5:47, backed the unit into Bay 3, and ran her equipment check: AED, oxygen, IV kit, trauma bag, by touch, without looking, the way a musician's hands move across familiar keys. A first-year resident named Pelham appeared in the break room to inform her the corner table was for residents. She moved to the far end without comment. The 8 a.m. transfer was Mr. Kowalski, 73, a dialysis patient with a mechanical heart valve that clicked in the quiet. He called Elena young lady and asked about her life with the curiosity of someone who had survived enough to find other people genuinely interesting. "You seem like a woman who could do many things," he said from the stretcher, "but you drive ambulance." "It suits me," Elena said. Mr. Kowalski's valve clicked its steady rhythm. "In Poland, my father was a professor. After the war, he drove trucks. He said it was the most honest work he ever did." A pause. He also said he missed the work that used his whole mind. Elena kept her eyes on the road. The morning passed in logistics. Elena moved through the service corridors and allowed herself a brief assessment of the ER through the internal windows. 2 incoming traumas, the triage nurse Adeze coordinating with the calm of someone who had done this 10,000 times. She moved on to the staging area. At 11:30, she was returning the crash cart to its charging position in the supply corridor when she heard the voice. She had heard Dr. Franklin Marsh's voice many times over the past 14 months, but always at a remove, through walls, down hallways, as ambient noise rather than direct communication. It was a voice engineered for authority, deep, unhurried, carrying the particular resonance of a man who had never once in his adult life been told to speak up. Marsh was 54, had trained at Johns Hopkins, completed his surgical residency at Mass General, and had been chief of emergency surgery at Hargrove for 9 years. His reputation was, by most clinical measures, deserved. He was an excellent surgeon. He was also a man who had confused excellence with entitlement so thoroughly and for so long that the two had fused into something indistinguishable. "Someone explained to me," Marsh was saying, his voice carrying through the open doorway of the supply corridor into the ER staging area, "why my crash cart was not in the primary position at 9 o'clock when I needed it." Elena paused. She looked at the cart she was currently returning. She looked at the charge log clipped to the side, which clearly showed it had been requisitioned at 8:52 a.m. by a resident whose name was on the log, not hers. Dr. Marsh. The cart was signed out by Adazi's voice, steady but careful. "I don't care who signed it out. I care that it wasn't where I needed it. That is a logistics failure." A pause. "Where is that paramedic? The one who handles transport?" Elena stepped through the doorway. "Here." Marsh turned. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, A brief, comprehensive assessment that concluded before it fully began, the way a man looks at a piece of furniture and determines it is adequate without studying the craftsmanship. The crash cart protocol. What is your understanding of it? Primary position is Bay 1, charged and sealed. Secondary position is the staging corridor outside Bay 3. Requisition requires attending signature. Elena recited it without inflection. Then why was my cart in the staging corridor at 9 o'clock? Because a resident requisitioned it at 8:52, which is within protocol. I returned it as soon as it was released. She indicated the cart. Marsh looked at the cart. He looked at the log. His jaw tightened in the specific way of a man who has been correct about a process, but incorrect about a culprit, and who finds this distinction irritating rather than clarifying. In the future, he said, his voice carrying the careful enunciation of a man choosing to remain technical rather than factual, I want the primary crash cart treated as priority equipment, non-negotiable availability. Understand? I understand, Elena said. Good. He turned back toward the ER. And make sure your manifest is filed by 11. Last week it was 11:07. He walked away. Adace caught Elena's eye across the corridor and offered a small, tired, apologetic shrug. Elena nodded once and went back to the staging area. She filed the manifest at 10:58 that day, and every day after. The incident that the nursing staff would later whisper about as the crash cart thing was minor, forgettable, entirely unremarkable in the daily life of a large urban trauma center. It was the kind of small, sharp indignity that accumulates in institutional environments the way silt accumulates in a riverbed, invisibly, incrementally, until the channel runs shallow. Elena did not discuss it. She drove her transfers, ran her checklists, drank her coffee at the far end of the break room table, and said nothing. But she noticed things. She noticed the way the ER processed mass casualty events, the coordination failures, the communication gaps, the predictable bottlenecks that formed at the supply staging area when two bays crashed simultaneously. She noticed the way certain residents hesitated at critical moments, the specific variety of hesitation that came from training rather than instinct. She noticed the way Dr. Marsh operated, technically precise, procedurally correct, and constitutionally incapable of working laterally with personnel he considered beneath the surgical line. She noticed these things the way she had always noticed things, catalogued them, filed them in the back of her mind under operational awareness, and said nothing. She had become very good at saying nothing. The quiet lasted 4 more months. And then, on a Tuesday in November, when the temperature had dropped to 11 degrees and a freezing rain was turning the hospital parking lot into a skating rink, everything broke open at once. The call came in at 7:14 p.m., Route 9 overpass collapse, 8 confirmed critical, possibly 20 total. ETA 11 minutes. Elena stood still for 2 seconds running the math. Level 2 center, 3 bays, Tuesday evening staff. The math was not comfortable. She went inside. The ER was already transitioning into mass casualty mode when she pushed through the internal doors. The overhead lights had shifted from their standard warm white to the harsher, whiter clinical setting that automatically activated under the trauma protocol. Adaeze was at the central desk, simultaneously coordinating on 2 phones and directing a pair of orderlies who were wrestling additional gurneys into position. The residents were pulling gear with varying degrees of efficiency. Marsh stood in the center of the bay, white coat open, assessing the space with the calculating stillness of a general surveying a field before engagement. Elena went to the supply staging corridor. Without being asked, she began pulling the secondary trauma kits, the ones that sat behind the primary equipment and were frequently overlooked in the initial chaos of a mass casualty event. She verified their contents, confirmed the hemostatic agents were current dated, checked the chest seal inventory. Pelham materialized at the corridor entrance. That's not your job. The ER techs are setting up Bay 3, Elena said. These kits haven't been inventoried since Thursday. The chest seals in Kit 2 are within 30 days of expiration. How do you know that? I inventory them, on Fridays. Pelham found nothing useful to say and left. Elena continued prepping. The first ambulance hit the bay at 7:26 p.m. After that, the next 40 minutes were the kind of controlled chaos that looks, from the outside, like pure pandemonium, but is, from the inside, a complex negotiation between the available resources and the incoming need. A negotiation that goes well or badly based almost entirely on the quality of the people managing the margins. The margins were where Elena lived. She positioned herself at the supply corridor threshold. Not her assignment, but the corridor needed her. She swept all 3 bays in a single assessment. Bay 1, crush injuries, BP dropping, access line fumbled twice. Bay 2. Thoracic trauma, paradoxical breathing, attending moving correctly. Bay 3. A teenage girl with a dramatic head wound, and a left arm held at the precise angle of a subclavian vascular injury. The resident in Bay 3 was focused entirely on the head wound. Elena stepped into Bay 3. The arm, Elena said. The second-year resident, Dr. Chen, one of the competent ones, looked up. Subclavian presentation, the color differential between the hands. Chen looked, saw it. The gray-blue of compromised perfusion in the left fingers against normal pink in the right. God, Chen breathed, you're right. Ultrasound, Elena said, already handing her the portable probe. Chen ran it and saw the disrupted vascular flow pattern. She was calling for Marsh before Elena had fully backed out of the bay. The next hour was relentless. Elena moved, assessed, supplied, and redirected with the careful invisibility of someone who understood exactly how much authority she did not have, and exactly how much she had to offer despite it. She positioned equipment, flagged information to the correct clinical ears, and kept the supply chain behind the bays from ever running dry, the work of the unseen hand. At 8:41 p.m., the mass casualty event stabilized. Critical patients were in surgery or on their way. The ER settled back into post-trauma exhaustion. Elena was restocking the secondary trauma kit in the supply corridor, replacing what had been used, verifying what needed to be ordered, when she heard the footsteps behind her. She knew, from the tempo and weight of them, that it was Marsh before he spoke. Vasquez, Marsh, white coat bloody at the cuff, betadine smear at the collar, arrived at anger after passing through several other emotions. You were in my bays. I was in the supply corridor. I flagged a subclavian vascular injury. You are a transport paramedic. Each word landed with deliberate weight. You drive the ambulance, you push the gurneys, you do not enter my trauma bays, you do not advise my residents. Is that clear? Elena thought of the girl's grey left hand. Of what would have happened to that hand if the head wound had kept the resident's full attention. Understood, she said. I am filing a protocol violation report. If it happens again, I will recommend termination. He turned back toward the ER. Elena continued restocking. Her hands were perfectly steady. The protocol violation report arrived in her personnel file 3 days later, exactly as Marsh had promised. Elena signed the acknowledgement form and returned it. No counterstatement. No meeting request. She had learned through a diase that the girl in Bay 3 had been discharged in 4 days with full vascular integrity. She went back to work. But the report had made Elena visible in the way documentation always does, not as a person, but as a record. And records attract attention from directions the filing party does not anticipate. Dr. Sandra Reeves, Hargrove's CMO, read every protocol violation report filed in the ER. She had learned through 15 years of administration that the important ones were never the ones that looked important. She read Elena's twice, pulled the full personnel file, made a phone call to a private number, and sat very still for 20 minutes after it ended. She filed what she'd learned in memory and waited. 2 weeks later, Marsh convened what his email called a clinical standards review, systematic protocol failures, transport and logistics department. Elena's name appeared in all 3 agenda items. She read the notice, closed it, and went to drive her transfer. Mr. Kowalski was her passenger that day. His valve clicked in the back of the ambulance. You are quiet today, he said. Like my father before a storm. He had this way of going very still, like he was saving his energy. Elena kept her eyes on the road. She thought about 11 years, 3 continents, 11 chest cavities, a goat shed, and a name she hadn't used in 14 months. Maybe, she said. The Friday of the review arrived wrapped in a grey November sky. Elena completed her morning transfer and arrived at the 3rd floor conference room at 9:58. Her folder of transfer logs and inspection records under her arm, not as a defense, but because she believed in having facts available. Marsh sat at the head of the table, flanked by the hospital administrator Dr. Gerald Holt and the HR director. At the far end, Dr. Reeves, expression unreadable. 3 department supervisors occupied the middle chairs as witnesses. Elena took the seat she was directed to, midway down the arrangement of someone being assessed rather than consulted. Miss Vasquez, Marsh began. He had a folder of his own, and he opened it with the deliberate precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment. Thank you for coming. I'll be direct. This review exists because of a pattern of behavior that represents a fundamental misalignment between your role at this institution and your apparent interpretation of that role. He spoke for 7 minutes. Elena listened. The most valuable intelligence always came from letting the other party speak first and completely. Marsh covered the crash cart incident, the Bay 3 intervention, 2 additional moments she had offered supply line guidance to residents, and the Friday inventory records, which he described not as a service but as unauthorized encroachment. The board's recommendation is that we restructure your role to strictly ambulance transport. External dock only, no internal access beyond the ambulance bay. A pause. If this is unacceptable, we are prepared to offer severance. Elena looked at Marsh, then at Reeves, who was watching with the expression of someone who already knows the final act. Before we proceed, Elena said, the first time she had spoken, I'd like to ask a question. Marsh's expression indicated this was not in his script. The girl from Bay 3, November 16th, 19 years old. Subclavian vascular injury, discharged in 4 days with full vascular integrity. Elena set her folder on the table. How did the clinical team plan to identify a subclavian injury presenting beneath a dramatic scalp laceration in an unresponsive teenager during a mass casualty event with 3 simultaneous criticals? The question hung in the air. Clinical, not accusatory. Marsh's jaw shifted. The attending was managing. The attending was in Bay 1. Elena did not raise her voice. I'm not challenging the process. I'm asking because it matters to the answer about my role. Holt started to speak. The door opened. The door opened. By the time the people around the table had fully registered who was standing in it, the situation was already irrevocably in motion. Dr. Reeves stood up. She had been expecting this. The man in the doorway was not tall in the way that draws attention, but he occupied space with the authority of someone who had spent decades being the person in the room whose presence defined what was permissible. Army Class A, dark blue turning almost black under fluorescent light, heavy with the ribbon stack of a career spanning decades, 4 silver stars on each shoulder. General Marcus Webb, Commanding General, United States Army Medical Command. Elena had not seen him in 3 years. Marsh half rose. This is a closed review. Sit down, doctor. 2 words. The quiet volume of a man who had never needed to raise his voice. Marsh sat. Webb walked to the head of the table. His aide placed a black folder on the surface without comment. Webb looked at Elena with the measured assessment of a man taking inventory of someone he had last seen somewhere utterly unlike this room. Captain Vasquez, he said. The title hit the room like a concussion, not loud, but with the physical quality of a shockwave. Holt made a sound that wasn't quite a word. A pen clattered onto the table. Elena stood up, not by decision, by muscle memory, 11 years burned below the level of thought. General, she said. Webb held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned to address the table. I am going to explain, he said, who this woman is, and then I am going to explain what happens next, and then I am going to leave. And the sequence in which those things happen is not negotiable. He opened the black folder. He did not look at it. He had not needed notes in many years. Captain Elena Vasquez served for 11 years as a Special Operations Combat Medic, eventually reaching the designation of Senior Medical Sergeant with Delta Force's Medical Specialty Program. She was assigned to 3 classified operational theaters across 2 continents. In that capacity, she performed or directed over 300 field medical interventions in non-permissive environments, including 11 emergency thoracic procedures with no surgical facility, no anesthesiologist, and in most cases, no second trained provider. Enquete. The room had achieved a quality of silence that Elena recognized from the field. The silence before and after something definitive. She holds, Webb continued, the Special Forces Medical Sergeant qualification, a program that requires mastery of surgical skills equivalent to a 3rd-year surgical residency, delivered in austere conditions with 0 institutional support. She holds a classified advanced trauma qualification that I am not at liberty to fully enumerate in this setting. A pause. She also holds the Silver Star, the Distinguished Service Cross, and the Soldier's Medal. He closed the folder. The name her unit gave her, Webb said, was Ghost Doc, because she had a talent for appearing exactly where a dying man needed her to be, and making the difference between that man living and dying. In 11 years, Captain Vasquez lost 6 patients under her hands in the field. 6. In non-permissive environments, under fire, without surgical suites, without blood banks, without the equipment in this building's supply corridor that she has been voluntarily inventorying on her own time for the past 14 months. Webb looked at Marsh. The chief of emergency surgery had gone the color of old chalk. The folder in front of him, the carefully assembled documentation of Elena's protocol violations and role boundary transgressions, sat untouched, as though he had forgotten it existed. She observed a subclavian vascular injury in your Bay 3 during a mass casualty event, Webb said, and she flagged it to the treating resident using the absolute minimum intervention necessary to preserve a patient's life. For this, you filed a protocol violation report. Webb's voice did not rise. It did not need to, and you subsequently initiated a proceeding to remove her from the clinical environment entirely. Marsh opened his mouth. That was not a prompt for your response, Doctor, Webb said. Marsh closed his mouth. Outside, beyond the conference room windows that overlooked the main hospital entrance, a sound had been building for the past several minutes. Low at first, then unmistakable. The heavy rhythmic percussion of rotor blades. Not one aircraft, multiple. Dr. Reeves, who had remained standing since Webb entered, walked to the window. 3 UH-60 Black Hawks were descending in formation toward the hospital's external parking area. Even at this height, through double-paned institutional glass, the downwash was visible, a visible disturbance in the November air, flattening the bare branches of the trees at the lot's perimeter, sending a sheet of old leaves spinning upward in a violent temporary vortex. They had not come for a landing. They had come to be seen. On the aircraft, Webb said, without turning toward the window, are 12 members of the 75th Ranger Regiment's medical company, including 3 combat medics who served under Captain Vasquez's direct training and guidance in the 2nd Operational Theater. They are here because I asked them to be here, because I wanted this institution to have a clear visual representation of what she built and what she represents. He picked up the black folder. He handed it to his aide. What happens next, Webb said, returning his gaze to the table, is this. Captain Vasquez's personnel file will be updated to reflect her full qualifications, which are currently, inexplicably, listed as some field experience. She will be offered a role commensurate with her actual capabilities. I will leave the specific architecture of that to Dr. Reeves, who I believe has some thoughts on the matter. He looked at Reeves. She nodded, once. And the protocol violation report filed by Dr. Marsh will be removed from her file. He looked at Marsh one last time. The look was not cruel. It was something, if anything, more difficult. It was the look of a man who had seen enough of the world to find willful ignorance more genuinely sad than deliberately malicious. She was trying, Webb said quietly, to make your hospital better. She was doing it invisibly, because she understood the hierarchy, and she respected it, even when it did not respect her. She flagged a dying girl's subclavian injury, and stepped back out of the bay. She inventoried your supply kits on her own time and filed the discrepancy reports correctly. She did not claim authority she wasn't given. She did exactly what she was trained, by an institution that spent 11 years and significant national resources on that training, to do, which is to save lives. He straightened. I suggest, Webb said, that you let her. The conference room held its silence for a long time after General Webb turned and walked back toward the door. His aide followed. The door closed with the muted, definitive click of institutional heavy wood, and the sound seemed to seal something, the way a hatch seals a pressurized chamber, making the shift between states permanent and precise. Nobody at the table moved for 3 full seconds. It was Dr. Reeves who moved first. She had remained standing by the window, her back partially turned toward the table, watching the 3 Black Hawks complete their demonstration arc over the parking lot. Now she turned back to the room with the expression of someone who has been waiting patiently for a meeting to catch up with what she already knew, and is relieved to find that it finally has. I'll need the room, she said. Except for Ms. Vasquez, Holt and Dennis from HR were already standing, their movement carrying the specific quality of people who want very much to be somewhere else and have been given official permission to go there. They went. The department supervisors followed with the careful neutrality of people who will discuss this extensively in private and say nothing at all in public. Marsh did not move immediately. He sat looking at the folder in front of him, the one he had assembled, the one containing the crash cart incident and the Bay 3 intervention, and the unauthorized inventory records, and his expression was the compound wreckage of a man processing the specific variety of humiliation that comes not from malice, but from comprehension. He had not known. That was the truth of it, and the truth of it was not a defense but a fact, and facts in Marsh's world were the only currency that ultimately mattered. He had not known because he had not asked, and he had not asked because he had not thought to, and he had not thought to because the woman across from him had been invisible in the way he had chosen to make her invisible, and she had let him. He looked at Elena. She was looking back at him without anger. That perhaps was the most difficult part, that her expression carried no victory, no resentment, no carefully banked satisfaction of the wronged party seeing justice delivered. She looked at him the way a clinician looks at a complex case, with full attention, with the acceptance of what is present, and with the clear-eyed understanding of what needs to happen next. He stood. He picked up his folder. He walked to the door, and as he passed Elena's chair, he stopped. She waited. "The girl in Bay 3, he said. His voice had lost its rehearsed authority. What was left was something smaller and more genuine, the subclavian injury. "Yes," Elena said. "Would Chen have caught it?" Elena considered the question honestly, because it deserved an honest answer. "Eventually," she said. "The question is when." Marsh nodded. It was a small, private nod, the kind that isn't for anyone else's benefit. Then he walked out of the conference room, and the door closed behind him. Dr. Reeves pulled out a chair and sat down across from Elena. For a moment, she simply looked at her, the way Elena had noticed her looking in the weeks since the protocol violation report, with the focused curiosity of someone assembling a picture from pieces that had previously seemed unrelated. "I made a phone call," Reeves said, "after I read your file." "I know," Elena said. "Your employment application listed some field experience." The box was small. Reeves let out a short, genuine sound that was not quite a laugh. "Elena, you performed emergency thoracic surgery in a goat shed." "It had good light," Elena said, and the smallest fraction of something that might have become a smile moved across her face and then did not quite arrive. "Structurally sound, actually. Better than some of the field stations." Reeves looked at her for another moment. Then she opened the folder she had brought to the meeting, her own, separate from Marsh's, thicker and older looking, the folder of a person who had been building a case rather than a complaint. "I have been the chief medical officer of this hospital for 6 years, Reeves said. "In that time, I have tried to solve one recurring problem that no amount of staffing adjustments or protocol revisions has adequately addressed. We lose patients at the margin, at the point between what our clinical staff can execute and what the situation actually requires. Not frequently, not catastrophically, but persistently." She looked at the folder. "We lose them in the supply corridor, when the chain breaks. We lose them in the bay, when the resident sees the dramatic injury and misses the silent one. We lose them in the lag between observation and intervention." She looked back up. "You have been solving those problems for 14 months, quietly, without authority, without credit, and apparently without expectation of either." Elena looked at the table. The surface was institutional laminate, and the overhead light made it look like water. "I had a counselor at the VA," she said slowly. "He told me I needed to find work that used the skills without the stakes, something where I could decompress, without the weight of the decisions." She paused. "I thought logistics was that. I thought pushing gurneys and running inventory was that." "Was it?" Elena was quiet for a moment. She thought about Mr. Kowalski's heart valve, clicking its patient rhythm. She thought about the girl in Bay 3, and the color of her left hand. She thought about the 11 years, and the 6 she had lost, and the hundreds she had not. She thought about Ghost Doc, and the fact that Ghost Doc had appeared in Bay 3 without a conscious decision, the same way she always had, because the patient needed her, and she was there, and the math was the math. "No," she said, "not entirely." Reeves nodded. She slid a document across the table. It was not an employment contract. It was a proposal, a document titled Director of Clinical Operations Integration, Emergency Services, Cross-Disciplinary Coordination, Protocol Development, Resident Training Integration, and Defined Emergency Intervention Authority in Mass Casualty Events. A position built around the shape of the ghost. She looked up. "The pay scale is executive administrative," Reeves said. "It reflects the scope, and I want to be clear that this is not a consolation offer. I have been planning this since the Thursday I read your file and made that phone call. I had already drafted the framework before Dr. Marsh filed his review notice. His meeting accelerated my timeline." A pause, which is, given the outcome, perhaps the most useful thing he has ever done without intending to. Elena looked at the document again. Her right shoulder ached with the low, familiar ache of the old injury, the one that had ended the operational career and begun everything that followed. She rotated it slightly, an unconscious habit, the physical equivalent of testing weight-bearing. "There's a condition," she said. Reeves raised an eyebrow. "The inventory," Elena said. "I want a dedicated equipment technician assigned to supply management with a standardized Friday protocol. The secondary trauma kits have been running on voluntary effort. That's a systemic vulnerability." If I'm in a different role, someone needs to own that function formally. Reeves looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote something in the margin of the proposal. Done, she said. Elena thought about the girl in Bay 3. The math. Ghost Doc appearing in that bay not by decision but by instinct, because the patient was there, and she was there, and the math was the math. She picked up the pen and signed. The protocol violation report was removed from Elena's file before close of business on Friday. The Director of Clinical Operations Integration role was approved by the board the following Monday, in a meeting that lasted 11 minutes, because nobody present who had seen the Black Hawks was in a mood to argue. Dr. Marsh returned to surgery and did not speak to Elena directly for 9 days. On the 10th, he appeared at the supply corridor doorway. I reviewed the subclavian injury rate in mass casualty presentations, he said. The words had cost him something to prepare. It's underdiagnosed at initial triage. Industry-wide, there's a literature review going back to 2017. I know, Elena said. I'd like to add a specific assessment protocol to the mass casualty checklist. He paused. If you think it would help. She looked at him. At the particular quality of a person who, confronted with the weight of what they didn't know, chooses to learn rather than leave. It would help, she said. I'll draft the language. 3 weeks later, walking the corridor at 5:47 a.m. out of habit, Elena passed ambulance bay 3. A new EMT had it covered, nothing needing her. She walked to the ER. Adaeze looked up from the charge desk. Corner table's yours if you want it. Elena poured her coffee and sat at the corner table. Through the window, the supply corridor stretched toward the ER bay where monitors glowed steady green. Her hands were still. The Black Hawks had come and gone. Webb's stars had caught the conference room light and disappeared back into the November sky. But Elena Vasquez had not needed the stars to know what she was. She had known it in a goat shed in a province she couldn't name. She had known it watching a teenager's hand go grey. She had known it with Mr. Kowalski's valve clicking its patient rhythm in the dark. A monitor alarmed down the corridor. Low battery. Routine. She looked up anyway. Old habits. The best ones never leave. If Elena's story of hidden depth and unstoppable quiet strength moved you, hit that like button and share this with someone who believes that the most powerful people in the room are often the ones saying the least. Subscribe for more stories of unsung heroes who carry the weight of worlds beneath ordinary uniforms, because real strength never needs to announce itself. Drop a comment below. Have you ever worked alongside someone who turned out to be far more than they appeared?